My name is Simone, and with the help of Tony Albert's exhibition, Visible, I'll be exploring the concept of representation, its ongoing effect on the Indigenous community, and how we, as pre-service teachers, have a responsibility to develop our awareness and understanding of bias representation to create an inclusive and trusting classroom for all students. Price discusses how representation can be compared to mirrors and windows. When a positive representation is used for Indigenous people, it provides a mirror for Indigenous students who previously would have been left out of the narrative. It allows windows into their lives for the non-Indigenous students who would otherwise have none to little understanding or exposure. This concept is important to implement across all minority groups. So what is representation? At the most basic, a representation is the way a person, place, or thing is portrayed or described. Because of this, it is important to understand representations are not neutral. They are affected by personal, cultural, and social views. They can therefore end up biased, manipulated, or authentic representations. Webb argues the process of representation does not simply make connections, relationships, and identities visible. They actually make those connections, relationships, and identities. In other words, the way we see ourselves and different groups of people represented within society contribute to forming our own identities and perceptions of those from different backgrounds. Tony Albert's exhibition, Invisible, challenges us to look at Indigenous representation under a new light. In the following interview, Tony goes into more depth about his extensive collection of Aboriginalia and why he was inspired to use them throughout his artwork.
So from a child, I've been collecting Aboriginalia. I've always been fascinated by the images emblazed upon various objects, from plates, cups, glasses, tea towels. Its meaning to me has changed from extremes in my life. The innocence of a childhood collection, the willingness to want to be surrounded by these objects that seemingly for me were like looking at pictures of family. The joy and amazement that we could have our images placed upon these day-to-day objects, to politically understanding the connotations behind them, the ways in which Aboriginal people are labelled, are relabelled, are anthropologically gazed upon, the sinister nature and undertones attached to them, the way in which Aboriginal people have been used to sell an industry, to sell a country, to sell tourism. There is elements of rescuing objects, of giving them a life they weren't able to originally have. They're about revoicing the objects, giving them a voice that they were once not only silenced, they were told in a way how they were supposed to be used. I think ultimately there is something intrinsically empowering about what happens to these objects once they're obtained.
Tony's exhibition is provocative with many layers entwined throughout each piece. Representation, however, is at the heart of each and every one. Tony discusses how he innocently began his collection as a child, being excited to finally have found a form of representation that he identified with. A vast difference from myself, who being of similar age, but white Australian, had no shortage of representation within my education and society. As Tony grew older and began developing a sense of identity, he started to recognise the culture bias held within these objects. Through his art, he is purposely changing the narrative by giving the objects a new voice. The ashtray pieces expose the viewers to a more sinister side of his collection by evoking the question, what does it mean to be putting a cigarette out on somebody's culture or identity? The playing card sculptures challenge the viewers to look at the seemingly innocent pack of playing cards, a common tourist souvenir with Indigenous children on them, through a different light. With a queen on one side and a young Aboriginal girl on the other, we are made aware of the hierarchy of the monarchy and a distinct class system. This leaves the viewer to consider the impact this has had on the young girl depicted. A combination of historical trauma and lack of authentic and positive representation of their culture and people, Indigenous children are at risk of struggling to find their identity. When Indigenous people are reflected and represented in a positive and contemporary way, it benefits all students. Indigenous students are affirmed, and non Indigenous students are educated, fostering understanding and a cultural change in society. Just like Tony's artwork, we as teachers need to be critically observing the representations used within the classroom, curriculum, and community, and actively including content reflective of the Indigenous people's experiences.